The night pressed gently against Manhattan's glass towers, the rain steady but soft. Inside a quiet diner tucked between tall office buildings, the scent of coffee filled the air. Few people came in at that hour. One of them was Mirabelle Ellis, seated near the window, hands wrapped around a warm cup she hadn't touched in minutes. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass. Tired eyes, a week-old worry she could no longer hide. The layoff from her firm had come without warning. Her mother's surgery bill sat unpaid. Her younger brother's tuition deadline loomed. She had stretched her savings until they broke. Still, she told herself she wouldn't crumble. Pride was all she had left, and pride didn't beg. Outside, a dark sedan stopped by the curb. A man stepped out, his coat catching the rain. He walked toward the diner with purpose, steady, calm, the kind of composure that filled a room before he spoke. The door chimed softly. Every head lifted for a moment, but his eyes found only one person. Mirabelle looked up, and their world shifted before either said a word. He walked straight to her table. "Miss Ellis?" His voice carried confidence and calm authority. She frowned slightly. "Yes?" He removed his gloves carefully, his tone measured. "My name is Grant Walkings. I believe we need to talk." Mirabelle studied him quietly. She had seen men like him before, people who never had to wait, who didn't flinch when the world demanded more. But something about his presence unsettled her. He looked out of place in that small diner with its flickering neon sign and cracked leather booths. She motioned to the empty seat across from her. "Go ahead." Grant sat down, unhurried. His coat still carried traces of rain. He folded his hands on the table, then spoke in a tone that was calm but deliberate. "You don't know me, Miss Ellis, but I know enough about you to be certain this will sound unusual." Mirabelle raised an eyebrow. "That's one way to start a conversation." He didn't smile. "I'll get to the point. I'm here to make you an offer." "An offer?" she repeated slowly. "You tracked me down for a business deal?" "In a way," he said, his gaze steady. "But this one's personal." Her pulse ticked faster. The last few months had taught her to be careful with strangers offering solutions. "If you're looking to invest, I don't have anything left to sell." He leaned back slightly. "You have more than you think. You have time, discretion, and integrity. I need all three." Mirabelle frowned, unsure whether to laugh or leave. "Why me?" Grant looked directly into her eyes. "Because I've seen how you handle hardship. You don't fold under pressure. You keep your word. I need someone like that." "For a year." "A year?" The word lingered. She couldn't tell if this man was serious or unwell. "Maybe you should start from the beginning," she said, her tone guarded. Grant nodded once. "Fair enough." He reached inside his briefcase, pulled out an envelope, and slid it across the table. The envelope stopped just short of her cup. Mirabelle stared at it, the edges faintly smudged from his rain-damp fingers. "What is this?" she asked, her voice even but wary. "Read it," Grant replied. She hesitated, then pulled the flap open. Her eyes scanned the neatly typed pages, legal terms, signatures, and at the bottom a figure so large her hand froze mid-air. $50 million? She whispered. Grant didn't flinch. "That's correct." She closed the folder, stunned. "You expect me to believe this is real?" "It is," he said, simply. "And it's yours, under one condition." Mirabelle leaned back, almost laughing from disbelief. "There's always a condition. I need a wife," he said plainly. "A legal marriage. No romance, no promises. Just 1 year." Her breath caught. "You're joking." "I'm not," he explained in measured words. His grandfather's will, the looming deadline, the control of Walking's group, hanging by a thread unless he married before year end. He didn't care for love or companionship. He needed an arrangement, a signature, and a quiet, dependable partner to play the part. Mirabelle's heart pounded. "You could have anyone," she said softly. "Why me?" "Because you don't want my money," he answered. "You need it, yes, but you won't worship it. That matters." She didn't know whether to feel insulted or impressed. "And you think I'd marry a stranger because I'm desperate?" He looked her straight in the eyes. "No, I think you'd do it because you're practical." The confidence in his tone unsettled her more than the proposal itself. She closed the folder and pushed it back toward him. "That's not practicality, Mr. Walkings. That's madness." He met her defiance with quiet certainty. Sometimes survival looks like madness from the outside. Silence settled between them, broken only by the hum of the rain against the glass. Mirabelle sat there long after Grant had left. The envelope remained on the table like a living thing, heavy and unreal. $50 million, enough to pay her mother's medical bills, her brother's tuition, and rebuild her life twice over. Yet the thought of saying yes made her chest tighten. She had spent years building a reputation for hard work, never shortcuts. To marry a man she barely knew felt like throwing all that away. She told herself no amount of money could replace dignity. Still, her mind wandered to her mother's voice over the phone that morning, weak but hopeful, asking if the surgery could happen soon. When the waitress came to clear the table, Mirabelle startled. "You okay, honey?" the woman asked kindly. Mirabelle nodded faintly. "Yeah, just thinking." Outside the rain had eased, but her thoughts hadn't. She picked up the envelope, hesitated, then slipped it into her bag. Not to accept, but to understand. That night in her apartment, she couldn't sleep. She walked from window to window, replaying his words. Sometimes survival looks like madness from the outside. By morning, her phone rang. It was the hospital. Her mother's condition had worsened. Another surgery was needed soon. The cost made her stomach twist. She stared at the envelope again. Her pride whispered, "Don't do it." But desperation asked, "What choice do you have?" She exhaled shakily. "Baby, madness isn't the worst thing," she murmured. Then she reached for her phone. The line rang only once before his voice answered, calm and certain. "Grant Walkings." Mirabelle's hand tightened around the phone. "It's me," she said softly. "I know." His tone carried no surprise, as though he'd been waiting. "I've read everything," she continued, "and I've thought about it all night." Silence stretched. She could hear the faint sound of his pen clicking, a rhythm of patience. "And?" he asked. "I'll do it," she said, "but on one condition." "What is it?" "You don't treat me like property." "I may be agreeing to your terms, but I'm still my own person." There was a pause, then a quiet exhale. "Agreed," he said. "You'll have my word." For a moment, neither spoke. Both knew life had just shifted into something they couldn't predict. When the call ended, Mirabelle lowered the phone and stared at her reflection in the dark screen. Her voice trembled, but her resolve held. "It's just 1 year," she whispered. "Then I walk away." The sun broke weakly through the clouds outside her window, glinting against the city rooftops. Somewhere across Manhattan, Grant folded away the signed contract and looked out his office window with a hint of unease, something he hadn't felt in years. He had money, power, control. Yet as he closed the file, a thought crossed his mind. He might have bought peace, but somehow it didn't feel like victory. If you were in Mirabelle's place, faced with a $50 million offer to save your family but marry a stranger, what would you do? Would you protect your pride or take the chance? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. The next morning arrived too quietly. The city was still shaking off the remnants of last night's rain when Mirabelle stood outside Grant Walking's glass tower on East 57th Street. Her reflection in the lobby door looked like someone else, calm on the outside, trembling on the inside. A receptionist led her up to the 42nd floor. The elevator ride felt endless, the soft hum echoing her heartbeat. When the doors slid open, Grant was already there, leaning against his desk, reading over the final draft of their agreement. He didn't look up right away. "I did think you'd call," he said without emotion. "I didn't think I would either," she replied. He gestured toward the chair opposite his. "It's all prepared. 1 year. Confidentiality, joint residence, a quiet separation when the term expires. You'll receive the full amount when it ends. Half up front, once the marriage certificate is filed." Mirabelle swallowed hard. It sounds simple when you say it. He set the papers in front of her. Simple doesn't mean easy. Her hand shook slightly as she signed. Each stroke of ink felt heavier than the last. When she reached the end, she paused and said quietly, "I hope you're not expecting me to play the perfect wife." Grant met her eyes. "I'm expecting you to play your part." Nothing more. Their eyes held for a beat too long before he said, "We'll marry at the courthouse tomorrow morning. Keep it private. My driver will pick you up at 9. Mirabelle nodded, sliding the folder back toward him. "Then, I suppose it's settled." When she left his office, her pulse thudded in her ears. She stepped into the elevator, clutching her bag. And for the first time in her life, she couldn't tell whether she was saving her family or selling her soul. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and rain. Mirabelle stood by the door, holding a small clutch in one hand and a folded tissue in the other. She wore a simple cream dress, neat, modest, chosen less for style and more for survival. There were no flowers, no music, no friends, just silence and the echo of footsteps on the marble floor. Grant arrived on time, as expected. His charcoal suit fit perfectly, his tie straight, his composure unbroken. He nodded at her politely, as though greeting a business associate. "You look presentable," he said. She forced a smile. "That's reassuring." The clerk led them to a small room where a judge waited with a thin smile. "Walkings, Ellis?" Grant answered with a quiet yes. The ceremony began almost immediately. The judge's voice droned through the formalities, legal names, declarations, signatures. There were no vows, no rings, just ink on paper and two people agreeing to something that barely resembled a marriage. When it was time to say "I do," Mirabelle's throat tightened. The words came out softly, almost like surrender. Grant's reply was steady, efficient, as though he were closing a deal. A few minutes later, it was done. The judge stamped the document and handed it to Grant. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Walkings." Mirabelle barely breathed. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the sky pale and grey. Grant offered her a ride. The cars waiting. She hesitated, then followed. The drive to his mansion was silent. He scrolled through his phone, responding to messages, while she stared out the window, trying to process what she had just done. She glanced at her hand. Bare, no ring, no warmth. A quiet ache settled in her chest. When they reached his home, Grant opened the door for her, but didn't touch her. "Welcome," he said. "Your new life starts here." She stepped out, her heels clicking against the stone path, her heart heavier than her suitcase. For the first time since she signed the contract, Mirabelle realized how permanent temporary could feel. The mansion stood tall and distant on a quiet stretch of upper Manhattan, surrounded by trimmed hedges and iron gates. Its size alone could swallow 3 city blocks. Mirabelle followed Grant through the wide entrance, her steps echoing against marble floors polished to a shine. The air felt too clean, too organized, like everything inside obeyed his sense of control. "This will be your home for the next 12 months, Grant said, as he walked ahead, his tone businesslike. "You'll find your belongings in the guest wing upstairs. Mrs. Keller, the housekeeper, will handle anything you need." A woman in her 50s appeared from the hall, polite but reserved. "Welcome, Mrs. Walkings," she said, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mirabelle nodded politely. "Thank you." Grant continued the brief tour. Dining room, library, gym. "My office is off-limits, unless I say otherwise. You'll have access to the garden and the studio for your own work. Dinner is served at 7. I expect punctuality." His words felt rehearsed, a routine he'd repeated to anyone under his command. When he finally stopped at the base of the grand staircase, he said, "We'll attend a few events together, but only when necessary. The rest of the time, you're free to live quietly. The less public attention, the better." Mirabelle looked around the massive foyer. "You don't waste words, do you?" "Efficiency saves time," he replied. She nodded slowly. "And emotions waste it." His gaze met hers for a brief moment before he turned away. "You'll learn how this works soon enough." Upstairs, her room overlooked the city skyline, a view that should have inspired awe, but instead reminded her how small she felt in his world. Her bag sat neatly by the bed, unpacked. She sat on the edge, running a hand over the comforter that smelled faintly of lavender. It wasn't home. It was a waiting room dressed in luxury. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked shut. That sound told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a matha. Next morning, Mirabelle found a note slipped under her door. It was handwritten, neat, and unmistakably Grant's. Rules for the house. She unfolded it carefully. Each line was direct, almost mechanical. At the bottom, one final line stood out in bold ink. "This is a partnership, not a union. Respect the boundary, and it will work." Mirabelle exhaled, setting the note on her nightstand. It felt less like marriage and more like employment. Later that day, she met him in the dining room for dinner. The long table could seat 20, but only 2 plates were set, far apart. He was already there, reading something on his tablet. "You received the list?" he asked without looking up. "I did." "And you understand?" "I do." He finally glanced at her. "Good. It's simpler this way." She set her fork down. "Simpler for who?" "For both of us," he replied. "I'm not interested in small talk, emotional displays, or personal history. I expect peace and order while this lasts." Mirabelle studied him quietly. "You sound like someone preparing for war." His expression didn't change. "War requires passion. I'm simply avoiding chaos." They ate in silence after that. Every sound, the clink of silverware, the faint tick of the clock, felt exaggerated in the stillness. When she rose to leave, Grant spoke again. "One more thing, Mirabelle." She turned. "Yes?" He met her eyes briefly. "Whatever happens, keep your emotions out of this. That's how we both win." Her chest tightened. "You make it sound like feelings are a liability. For me, they always have been." She nodded once and walked away. In that moment, she understood him more than he intended. This was a man who had built walls so high, even his own heart couldn't see daylight. Days folded into weeks, and the mansion's silence began to weigh on Mirabelle. The house was spotless, filled with light during the day and quiet at night, but it carried no warmth. Every morning, Mrs. Keller served breakfast promptly at 8. Grant never joined her. He left for work early, his footsteps brisk, his cologne fading down the hall before she finished her coffee. Mirabelle tried to settle into a rhythm, reading in the library, taking long walks through the garden, sometimes watching the skyline from the balcony, but every sound reminded her she didn't belong. The staff treated her respectfully, yet with a hint of restraint. They spoke softly, as though she were a guest who might leave any day. At night, she often heard Grant moving through the house, his office door opening and closing, the faint rustle of papers long after midnight. They rarely crossed paths except during dinner. Those evenings were polite, but distant. He'd ask if she needed anything, and she'd answer with the same formal tone. One Friday evening, as she passed the living room, she noticed him standing by the fireplace, reading something on his phone. Without thinking, she paused. "Do you ever stop working?" He looked up, slightly surprised. It keeps things predictable. Doesn't predictability get lonely? He didn't respond. The silence said enough. She nodded faintly. Good night, Grant. He hesitated before replying. Good night, Mirabelle. Back in her room, she looked around. The elegant decor, the soft sheets, the untouched closet lined with designer clothes he had arranged for her. It was all beautiful, but it felt borrowed. Her mind wandered to her mother's voice, the laughter of her brother, the life she had left behind. Here, even comfort felt like confinement. Before turning off the light, she whispered to herself, 1 year. The words sounded less like reassurance and more like survival. She wasn't living. She was existing in a story that didn't belong to her yet. Morning light spilled across Mirabelle's room, catching the edges of the white curtains as she opened her eyes. The mansion remained still, the kind of stillness that tested one's sanity, yet she rose each day with purpose. She couldn't let silence defeat her. She began structuring her days. After breakfast, she would review her mother's medical updates, handle online payments, and manage her brother's college paperwork. When that was done, she read financial journals to keep her mind sharp. The arrangement had taken her career, but not her discipline. She also took walks through the garden. The air there felt freer than anywhere inside the mansion. She often paused by the rose bushes near the gate, trimming them carefully, even though no one asked her to. It gave her a small sense of control, a way to remind herself she was still capable of shaping something. The staff noticed. Mrs. Keller began greeting her with less formality, sometimes even staying, to chat for a few minutes about the weather or her favorite recipes. The cook occasionally slipped her a new dish to try. Slowly, the people around her stopped seeing a stranger and started seeing a woman who carried herself with quiet grace. At night, she kept a journal. Each entry began the same way: I will not lose myself. Writing gave her strength, a promise to remain grounded amid luxury that wasn't hers. One evening, she stood by her window and looked toward the city lights below. Somewhere out there, people were fighting their own battles, unseen and uncelebrated. She smiled faintly. So am I, she whispered. Grant still moved through the house like a shadow, controlled, distant, unbothered. But every time he passed her in the hallway, he found her calm, composed, never bitter. She didn't demand attention. She simply endured with quiet dignity. That poise began to intrigue him in ways he didn't understand yet. Mirabelle didn't know it, but her strength, the very thing she thought he'd never notice, was slowly starting to chip away at the walls around his heart. Grant Walkings lived by order. Every morning began at 5:30 sharp. His alarm never needed to ring twice. He worked out alone in the home gym, reviewed financial reports while his coffee brewed, and left the house before 7. His driver waited precisely at the front gate. Never a minute early, never a minute late. To outsiders, he seemed like the definition of discipline. To Mirabelle, he looked like a man trying to outpace his own thoughts. His world was numbers, contracts, and meetings that stretched across time zones. When he came home, he went straight to his study. Lights stayed on late into the night. The sound of papers rustling was the only proof he was there. Mirabelle saw patterns in him that reminded her of cold machinery, efficient but lonely. He spoke when necessary, ate when expected, and never lingered. If she tried to start a conversation, it ended with a polite nod or a brief, "I have work." One evening, she passed his office door and overheard him on a call. His tone was clipped, commanding. No emotional bias. Execute the merger cleanly. The phrase echoed in her mind. No emotional bias. That seemed to be his rule for everything, even life. Dinner remained a quiet ritual. He'd read from his tablet, and she'd eat in silence, pretending to be fine. Sometimes he'd ask about her mother's recovery, but always as if it were a checklist item, not concern. Yet, she noticed small details about him others would miss. He never left dishes unfinished, His watch was always aligned with the edge of the table. His phone screen was spotless. No smudges, no distractions. The man treated every inch of his existence like a meeting he couldn't afford to lose. The mansion, for all its beauty, reflected that same perfection. Every rug centered, every shelf symmetrical. It didn't feel lived in. It felt preserved. Mirabelle started realizing something. Grant wasn't cruel. He was afraid. Afraid of what happened when order slipped. Afraid of needing anyone. Afraid of seeing that wealth could buy everything but peace. And though she didn't understand him fully, part of her pitied him. Because while he lived in control, she lived in quiet uncertainty. Both were prisons, his built from pride, hers from sacrifice. Mirabelle tried to find small ways to bring life into the mansion. It wasn't defiance, it was survival. The silence that hung over the halls was unbearable, and if she couldn't change Grant's demeanor, she could at least soften the space they shared. She started with little things. Fresh flowers from the garden on the dining table, a soft jazz playlist echoing faintly through the living room in the evenings, home-cooked meals that replaced the chef's precise but flavorless dishes. She even added color, throw pillows, books on side tables, and candles that smelled faintly of vanilla and cedar. The staff noticed. "The house feels warmer, ma'am," Mrs. Keller said one morning as she adjusted the curtains. Mirabelle smiled faintly. "That's the goal." But Grant didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he said nothing. He still came home at the same hour, still retreated into his office with his laptop, still carried the invisible armor that kept people from getting close. If dinner felt less like an obligation and more like a meal, he didn't say it. Once, she even waited up for him, something she hadn't done since their first month together. It was past midnight when the sound of his car echoed in the driveway. She reheated a plate and set it on the counter before he entered. When he walked in, he paused briefly, surprised to see her. "You're still awake?" She nodded. "You missed dinner. Thought you might be hungry." He loosened his tie, his tone polite but distant. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said quietly. "But I wanted to." He gave a brief nod, took a sip of water, and left the plate untouched. "Good night, Mirabelle." She stood there long after he was gone, staring at the untouched food. The air between them felt like glass, clear, fragile, and impossible to cross without breaking something. Over the next few days, she tried less. The music stopped. The flowers wilted without replacement. Even Mrs. Keller noticed the difference. "You've gone quiet," she said gently. Mirabelle smiled faintly. "I'm learning from the best." Still, there were moments she caught glimpses of something human in him. A tired sigh when he thought no one was watching, or a distant look when he sat alone after dinner. She wondered if loneliness ever reached him, or if he had learned to mute it completely. The house had everything money could buy, yet it lacked the one thing neither of them seemed able to give: warmth freely offered and freely received. And though her gestures went unnoticed, Mirabelle held on to one truth. Kindness said more about who she was than who noticed it. The headlines came slowly at first, then all at once. It started with a photo. Grant and Mirabelle leaving a gala, hand in hand, her expression unreadable. The headline read, "The Billionaire's Secret Bride." Within days, the tabloids ran wild with stories. Every detail of their lives was suddenly public property. Reporters speculated about her background, her past job, even her wardrobe. Some called her mysterious. Others were cruel, branding her a contract wife or fortune seeker. Grant, as usual, ignored it. His PR team issued a single statement. Mr. and Mrs. Walkings prefer privacy. That was it. He refused interviews, declined photo shoots, and carried on as though nothing had changed. Mirabelle didn't have that luxury. She couldn't step outside without noticing the stares. When she went to the grocery store, 2 cameras followed. When she visited the hospital to see her mother, she overheard nurses whispering her name. Even her brother called one night uneasy. They're saying things online, Mira. Stuff that's not true. I know, she said softly. Let them talk. They'll move on to someone else soon. But they didn't. A week later, a magazine ran an article questioning whether their marriage was real. They published anonymous sources claiming she lived separately, that Grant never mentioned her at work, that she was rarely seen with him in public. The words cut deeper than she expected. When she confronted him that evening, he didn't look up from his tablet. You shouldn't read that garbage. Easy for you to say, she replied. They're not dissecting your life. He set the device down slowly. You wanted this arrangement. Attention comes with it. I wanted a way to help my family, she said, her voice low but steady. Not to become your rumor shield. His expression softened slightly, but his tone stayed measured. Public noise doesn't touch what matters. Ignore it. She almost laughed. What matters, Grant? The company? The headlines? He didn't answer. That night, Mirabelle sat by her window long after midnight. Flashbulbs from parked photographers flickered faintly outside the gate. She wondered if they saw her silhouette through the curtains, and what story they'd invent next. For the first time, she understood what his silence really protected. Not peace, but avoidance. He had spent his whole life controlling narratives. Now, he was losing the one person who refused to be part of his script. Still, she refused to break. She showed up at public events when required, smiled for the cameras, and walked beside him without letting them see her pain. They called it mystery. She called it strength. The annual Ashford Foundation charity dinner filled the ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel with muted laughter, champagne, and camera flashes. It was the kind of event Grant attended every year, elegant, controlled, predictable. For Mirabelle, it was another performance, another night to play the part of a wife she still didn't know how to be. She wore a sleek black gown Grant's stylist had selected, understated but graceful. When she stepped out of the car, the crowd erupted with the click of cameras. Grant offered his arm, and though his touch was polite, there was a steadiness to it that surprised her. Inside, conversations buzzed about mergers, board seats, and donations. Mirabelle smiled where she needed to, spoke when spoken to, and tried to ignore the whispering eyes. She'd grown used to being a headline, but that night felt different, meaner. As they mingled near the main table, a woman approached with a sharp smile. "Mrs. Walkings," she said sweetly, "you've adjusted to this life faster than most. Quite impressive, considering where you started." The insult hid behind her tone, but everyone nearby caught it. A few chuckled under their breath. Mirabelle held her composure. "Thank you. I believe adjustment is easier when you have purpose." The woman's smirk deepened. Purpose or incentive? Before Mirabelle could respond, Grant's voice cut through the tension. "Ah!" The table went silent. He stood beside Mirabelle, his hand lightly resting at her back. A small but deliberate gesture. His expression was unreadable, but his tone carried weight. "My wife doesn't owe anyone an explanation for her presence here," he said. "She's here because I value her. Anyone with questions about that can address them to me directly." The woman's smile faltered. "I meant no offense, Grant." "Of course you did," he replied, his gaze cool. "But let's not pretend otherwise." Mirabelle felt every pair of eyes on them. For the first time, Grant wasn't the man hiding behind silence. He was the one breaking it. He turned to her, lowering his voice. "You don't have to prove anything to them." She met his eyes, unsure how to respond. "That's the first kind thing you've said to me in weeks." A faint smile touched his lips. "Maybe I should say more." The night moved on, but something between them shifted. Later, when the event ended and they returned to the car, neither spoke for several minutes. The city lights blurred past the windows. Then Grant said quietly, "You shouldn't have to fight alone." Mirabelle looked at him, studying the side of his face, the subtle tension in his jaw. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't answer, but she caught the briefest glance in her direction before he turned away. It wasn't affection yet, but it was something close, respect. And for the first time, Mirabelle wondered if the man she'd married for money might still have a heart worth discovering. The days after the charity dinner felt lighter, in ways Mirabelle couldn't explain. Nothing outwardly changed. Grant was still reserved, his schedule still precise. But there was a subtle difference in how he looked at her. The air between them no longer carried only silence. It carried awareness. When they crossed paths in the hallway, his eyes lingered a second longer. When she spoke, he listened, even if briefly. It wasn't warmth yet, but it was a shift, an acknowledgement that she existed beyond the boundaries of their contract. Mirabelle didn't dwell on it. She didn't want to read meaning where none was promised. Still, her heart noticed what her mind tried to ignore. One morning, she was in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Keller arrange flowers when Grant walked in earlier than usual. He looked surprised to see her holding a vase, her sleeves rolled up. "I didn't know you handled that," he said. She smiled faintly. "I like keeping busy. Helps the house feel alive." He hesitated before replying. "It does look better." It was a small compliment, but from him it felt like a bridge. Later that week, they attended another fundraiser. The same people who once whispered behind their backs now greeted Mirabelle warmly. Grant stayed close by, occasionally placing a guiding hand on her back when they moved through the crowd. Every gesture was calculated but gentle. He was learning that care didn't always mean loss of control. That night, in the car on their way home, Mirabelle finally broke the quiet. "Why did you defend me at the dinner?" He kept his gaze on the road. "Because they were wrong. You don't usually care about opinions." "I don't," he said after a moment. "But I care about fairness." She studied him silently. "And you think life's been unfair to me?" He glanced her way. "I think I've made it harder than it needed to be." The admission surprised her. Grant didn't apologize. He adjusted. That was his version of humility. When they reached the mansion, she lingered by the door. "Yeah, don't have to walk me in," she said. "I know," he replied. Yet he followed her anyway. At the top of the stairs, she turned back. "Good night, Grant." He paused, the faintest smile touching his lips. "Good night, Mirabelle." As she entered her room, she felt something unfamiliar. Comfort. For the first time since this arrangement began, she didn't feel like a stranger in her own life. Neither of them spoke about it, but both knew something irreversible had started to take root. The contract was still in place, but beneath its surface, a quiet current was beginning to move, one neither of them could stop nor fully understand. The storm began without warning. By evening, thunder rumbled across the city, and the first flashes of lightning lit the sky beyond the mansion's tall windows. The wind pressed against the glass, and the rain came in sheets, blurring the view of the streetlights outside. Mirabelle had been in the library reading when the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. Silence followed, broken only by the sound of rain on the roof. She waited a moment, hoping the generator would kick in, but it didn't. She reached for her phone, but the signal was weak. The entire block must have been affected. With a sigh, she walked down the hall toward the kitchen, her footsteps soft against the carpet. She found a few candles in a drawer and began lighting them, one by one, their small flames casting soft halos of gold against the dark. The faint sound of footsteps made her turn. Grant appeared at the doorway, a flashlight in his hand. His tie was gone, sleeves rolled up, the storm catching faintly in his eyes. "Generators down," he said. "I've already called maintenance. They're on their way." Mirabelle nodded, her face lit by the flickering candlelight. "I figured as much. Until then, it looks like we'll have to rough it." He gave a half smile. "You make that sound tragic." She shrugged. "Depends on how well you handle the dark." For a moment, the air felt different, lighter, even playful. He stepped forward and set the flashlight on the counter. You always find calm in chaos, he said quietly. Most people panic. I've had practice, she replied. You learn to stay calm when life doesn't give you much choice. The words lingered. The light from the candles danced across her face, softening the usual guarded lines of her expression. Grant looked around, then said, Stay here. I'll check the breaker box. When he turned to leave, she said, You don't have to fix everything, Grant. Sometimes you just wait it out. He paused, glancing back. I'm not good at waiting. I noticed, she said, a small smile pulling at her lips. He gave a quiet laugh before disappearing into the hall. As thunder rolled again, Mirabelle stood by the window, watching streaks of lightning flash across the skyline. For once, the mansion didn't feel cold. It felt alive. Something about the storm made everything inside, the walls, the silence, even their distance, feel ready to shift. Grant returned a few minutes later, rain dampening the edges of his white shirt. The power was still out. He wiped his hands on a towel and joined Mirabelle at the counter. The candles she'd lit earlier flickered between them, their glow softening his usually sharp features. Breaker's fine, he said. Looks like the grid's down. It'll take time. She nodded. So we wait. He gave a quiet sigh and leaned against the counter beside her. The faint rhythm of rain filled the silence. For once, he wasn't looking at his phone or a document. He was just there, present. Mirabelle broke the quiet. You're not used to this, are you? Waiting. He gave a wry smile. Not really. I like control. I don't do well when things slip out of order. You mean when people slip out of order? She said gently. His eyes met hers. Maybe both. The room fell silent again, not awkward, but heavy with something unspoken. Then, unexpectedly, he said, My father used to disappear during storms. Mirabelle turned slightly toward him. Disappear? Grant nodded slowly. He'd leave the house for hours. My mother would sit by the window, pretending not to care, but I could see her hand shaking on the glass. He'd come back smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, and she'd forgive him. Every time. He looked away for a moment, his voice quiet but steady. She taught me love means endurance. He taught me it means weakness. I never figured out who was right. Mirabelle studied him, seeing beyond the flawless surface he presented to the world. Maybe they were both wrong. Love isn't weakness, but it isn't endurance either. It's balance. He gave a faint laugh. No mockery, just surprise. Balance sounds too rational for something that ruins people. Maybe it ruins the wrong ones first, she replied softly. He turned toward her fully now, his expression bare in a way she'd never seen. You talk about love like it's still worth believing in, she held his gaze. Because I've seen what happens when people stop believing. They turn cold, empty. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he exhaled slowly, almost as if the conversation had lifted a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. For a long moment, they said nothing. The storm outside grew louder, but inside, everything felt still. Grant finally spoke again, quieter this time. Maybe you're right. Maybe, she said. But you'll never know unless you stop running from it. He gave her a look that lingered longer than it should have, as if her words had found a place he hadn't let anyone reach before. The walls between them hadn't fallen, but they were starting to crack, and neither seemed eager to rebuild them. The rain softened into a steady hum outside, a rhythm that filled the quiet between them. The candlelight had grown dimmer, flickering against the walls in slow waves. Grant leaned against the counter, his sleeves still damp, the faint scent of rain clinging to him. Mirabelle reached for another candle, trying to light it, but her match snapped in half. She frowned, trying again, her fingers trembling slightly from the cold. Grant stepped closer, his voice low. Here, let me. Their hands met at the edge of the counter, brief, unplanned, warm. Neither pulled away. For a heartbeat, the world felt suspended. He took the candle from her, striking a fresh match. The soft flame caught, lighting his face in amber hues. He handed it back carefully, his fingers brushing hers again. It wasn't deliberate, but it wasn't an accident either. "Thanks," she murmured. "You're welcome," he said, his tone quieter than usual. The moment should have ended there, but neither of them moved. Mirabelle set the candle down, her pulse quickening as she met his gaze. The distance that had defined their marriage suddenly felt smaller, almost fragile. He looked at her like he was seeing something he hadn't allowed himself to before. Someone strong, calm, yet capable of softening the sharp edges of his world. "Mirabelle," he said finally, her name landing between them like something sacred. She swallowed. "Yes?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You make quiet feel less lonely." Her breath caught, not because the words were romantic, but because they were honest. "And you make control look exhausting," she replied softly. That made him laugh, a real, unguarded sound that startled them both. "I don't laugh much," he admitted. "I noticed," she said with a half-smile. For a long second they stood there, the air warm but heavy, their closeness charged with something neither wanted to name. His hand brushed hers again, slower this time. She didn't move. When thunder rolled again, she flinched slightly, and he instinctively reached out, his palm settling over her fingers. It was protective, gentle, almost uncertain. Their eyes locked. The moment stretched thin, full of meaning they couldn't voice. She was the first to step back, breaking the fragile connection. "I should check the upstairs windows," she whispered. Grant nodded, his voice low. "Right." As she walked away, his gaze followed her, the warmth from her touch still lingering like a pulse he couldn't shake. For years he had avoided touch because it demanded emotion. But that single moment had said more than any vow they had ever exchanged. And as the storm rumbled outside, both of them knew something had changed. The storm lingered through the night, wind pressing against the mansion windows as thunder rolled in the distance. Upstairs, the candles Mirabelle had lit earlier glowed faintly, their scent of vanilla drifting through the hall. She walked slowly toward her room, her thoughts louder than the rain. Her pulse hadn't settled since that moment in the kitchen. The touch, the way he said her name, the look in his eyes that held no calculation, no contract, just truth. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She paused by the balcony window, watching streaks of lightning flash over the city. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her, strong, composed, yet unsure. "What are you doing?" she whispered to herself. She turned at the soft creak of the floor behind her. Grant stood in the doorway, still in his rolled-up sleeves, his expression unreadable. "You're awake," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she replied. He nodded once. "Neither could I." He stepped closer, the candlelight catching the faint tension in his jaw. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them felt warm, alive with something new and unspoken. "Earlier," he began, his tone quiet, "I didn't mean to cross a line." "You didn't," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You just reminded me I still feel." That made him pause. "And that's a bad thing?" "It's dangerous," she said, "for both of us." He looked at her, something flickering in his eyes, a mix of restraint and longing. "You think feeling is more dangerous than pretending?" She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "Pretending is safer. You of all people should know that." He took another step closer, stopping only a breath away. "Safe doesn't always mean right." Her chest rose and fell, the nearness of him stirring something she'd tried to bury. His cologne still carried the faint trace of rain. Her hand trembled slightly, and before she could stop herself, she reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His gaze followed the movement, steady and intent. The silence that followed was full, soft, charged, fragile. His fingers twitched, as if to reach for her again, but he didn't. She took a step back before he could. "Good night, Grant," she said, her tone gentle but firm. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Good night, Mirabelle." When he left, the door closed with the quietest click. She stood there, hand over her heart, feeling its uneven rhythm. In another life, maybe they would have met without contracts or conditions. But tonight, they were two people standing on opposite sides of a promise they didn't know how to keep. And though neither said it aloud, both understood. They had crossed a line that could never be erased. The next morning brought calm skies and pale sunlight streaming through the tall windows. The storm had passed, but the air inside the mansion still carried the weight of what had almost happened. Grant left early for work, quieter than usual. Mirabelle watched his car pull away from the balcony, her thoughts still tangled in the night before. There had been no kiss, no confession, but something had shifted. And no matter how much they tried to pretend, they both knew it. She walked into the kitchen, the faint scent of candle wax still lingering. The same counter where their hands had brushed felt different now. It wasn't just marble, it was memory. Mrs. Keller entered softly. "You're up early, ma'am." Mirabelle smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep well." The older woman studied her for a moment. "You look like someone trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense." Mirabelle gave a quiet laugh. "That's about right." Later that afternoon, she sat by the garden window with her tea, thinking about everything. Their contract, the money, her mother's health, her brother's dreams, and the strange pull she felt toward a man who had once treated her like a transaction. Was it wrong to care for someone who had bought her name? Was it foolish to see kindness in moments that were never supposed to mean anything? She remembered the way Grant's hand lingered over hers, how his voice softened when he spoke. Of his parents, how his laughter, rare and unguarded, made the mansion feel less empty. Somewhere between duty and distance, something human had found a way to breathe. Her phone buzzed. A notification popped up from her channel's community post. "What do you think? Can love grow in a marriage built on money?" She smiled slightly, reading the comments that had started pouring in. Some wrote, "Love can grow anywhere if both hearts change." Others argued, "Money kills real connection. There's no room for truth when one person is paid to stay." She leaned back in her chair, thinking about both sides. Maybe they were all right in their own way. Love couldn't be planned. It couldn't be traded or bought. It could only grow when two people stopped trying to control it. And though she didn't know what came next, Mirabelle realized something important. She wasn't powerless in this story. The contract had started as survival, but how it ended, whether in heartbreak or redemption, would depend on both of them choosing honesty over fear. As the camera of her mind shifted toward the viewers, her voice would ask, quietly, if love begins as an agreement, can it still become real? Or does every price paid come with a cost the heart can't afford? The question hung there, waiting for reflection. The story wasn't finished. It was only beginning to test what was real. The mansion felt different now. It wasn't loud or warm, but the silence had changed. It no longer pressed down like weight. It breathed. Mornings began to hold small surprises. Grant had started coming to breakfast. Not every day, but often enough that Mrs. Keller stopped looking shocked. He would appear by the doorway, loosened tie, sleeves rolled up, greeting her with a quiet, "Good morning." The first time he said it, Mirabelle nearly dropped her spoon. She returned the greeting softly, unsure if it was politeness or something more. Breakfasts became their new rhythm. Sometimes he read the paper while she stirred her tea. Other mornings, they talked about simple things, her mother's recovery, her brother's progress in school, a new company he was acquiring. Their words were still careful, but no longer cold. One morning, she teased, "Do billionaires usually make time for coffee at home?" He smiled faintly. "Only when the company is worth it." Her heart skipped before she could stop it. They'd started sharing small jokes, stolen glances, and those quiet pauses that said more than words could. Even the staff noticed. The tension that had once defined the mansion had been replaced by something gentler, something that made the air easier to breathe. One afternoon, Mirabelle found Grant in the garden on a conference call. He wasn't the polished, impenetrable figure from the boardroom. He was relaxed, his voice calm, one hand in his pocket as he paced between the roses. When he saw her watching from the terrace, his expression softened in a way that felt private, almost intimate. Later that evening, as she passed his office, he looked up from his work. "Dinner in 20?" he asked. She nodded, smiling slightly. "I'll be there." It wasn't grand gestures or dramatic confessions that changed things. It was the consistency, the quiet acts of showing up, the small, invisible threads of connection slowly weaving between them. Mirabelle found herself smiling for no reason sometimes, humming while, setting the table, lingering by his door when she heard his voice. It scared her how natural it was becoming, how easy it was to forget they were never supposed to feel this way. The contract had bound them by paper, but now something unseen was binding them by choice. Grant was never the type to express affection openly. Words weren't his strength, actions were. And lately his actions had started to say more than he realized. It began one quiet Saturday morning. Mirabelle walked into the kitchen expecting the usual Mrs. Keller preparing breakfast, the faint sound of the coffee maker, but instead she froze. Grant was there, standing by the stove in a navy t-shirt, sleeves pushed up, holding a spatula like it was foreign equipment. "Good morning," he said, trying to sound casual as the smell of burnt pancakes filled the air. She covered her mouth, laughing softly. "You're cooking?" "Attempting to," he admitted, flipping something that no longer looked like food. "I thought it was time I learned a basic skill. Is this your idea of a business challenge?" she teased. He smirked, more like risk management. She stepped beside him, gently taking the spatula from his hand. "You're too tense. Pancakes need patience." He watched as she stirred the batter, her movements calm and practiced. "You make it look easy." "Only because I've burned enough of them to learn." He chuckled, a real one, the kind that reached his eyes. For a moment they moved in sync, flipping pancakes and sharing glances that lingered a little too long. When they finally sat to eat, his plate looked uneven, but he didn't care. He was smiling, and that was rare enough to notice. Later that week, another quiet gesture appeared. Mirabelle returned from visiting her mother to find her room rearranged. The desk had been replaced with a small reading corner, a chair, a lamp, and her favorite books from her old apartment. A note lay on the cushion in his handwriting. "You mentioned you missed your space. Consider this yours." She held the note for a long time, her throat tight. Over the following days, more of these subtle shifts appeared. A bouquet of white lilies, the kind her mother loved, placed on the dining table without a word. Her laptop charger replaced after it broke. Even her favorite tea stocked in the kitchen, though she'd never mentioned the brand aloud. He noticed everything. Quietly, carefully. Once, during dinner, she looked at him and said softly, "You pay attention when no one's asking you to." He shrugged, though a faint smile tugged at his lips. "Maybe I'm learning." "Learning what?" she asked. His gaze held hers for a moment longer than comfort allowed. "That care isn't weakness." The air stilled between them, heavy with meaning. She lowered her eyes, smiling faintly, but her heart beat faster. For someone who claimed not to believe in love, Grant Walkings was proving, without saying a word, that even the most guarded hearts can change when someone quietly teaches them how. It happened slowly, the way sunrise replaces darkness, quietly, without asking permission. Mirabelle had spent most of her adult life protecting herself from disappointment. She believed love was something that belonged to other people, the kind who didn't have to choose survival first. But lately, when she looked at Grant, she felt the ground shift beneath her. She noticed the little things first. The way he paused to listen when she spoke, even if it was about something small. How he'd glance up from his laptop during dinner, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The way his voice softened when he said her name. One afternoon, she found herself watching him from across the living room as he read through a stack of documents. He sat near the window, sunlight brushing against his face, his brow slightly furrowed in thought. For a moment, she didn't see the billionaire with his walls and rules. She saw a man, focused, flawed, human, and her heart reacted before her mind could stop it. She tried to reason with herself. It was admiration, not affection. Gratitude, not love. But every time he smiled, the argument unraveled. When she worked late on her laptop, he would sometimes appear by the door. "You shouldn't strain your eyes," he'd say. "Take a break." And she would, only because he asked. The distance between them had once felt like a line drawn in stone. Now it was something softer, almost welcoming. She caught herself reaching for things he liked, remembering his coffee order, noticing when he seemed tired. These weren't duties. They were instincts, proof that her heart was no longer neutral. One night, she woke from a dream she couldn't remember, her pulse racing. The house was quiet, but her thoughts weren't. She got up, walked to the kitchen for water, and found Grant sitting there, papers spread on the counter. "You're up late," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he replied. "Too much on my mind." "Work?" He looked at her for a long second. Not just work. Something in his tone made her chest tighten. She smiled faintly to mask it. "Try not to overthink everything." He nodded. "That advice works better for people who don't live in their heads." She walked past him, brushing his shoulder lightly as she reached for a glass. The touch lasted less than a second, but it left a tremor in the quiet air. When she returned to bed, her thoughts refused to settle. She pressed a hand against her chest, whispering to herself, "This wasn't supposed to happen." But it already had. The contract might have started their story, but her heart was rewriting it in real time, and for the first time in years, she was both terrified and alive. The evening felt ordinary at first, quiet music in the background, the faint scent of roasted garlic filling the air, and the soft hum of the city beyond the tall windows. Mirabelle was setting the table when Grant walked in, his jacket draped over his arm, his expression more relaxed than usual. "Something smells good," he said, setting his briefcase aside. "Dinner," she replied with a small smile. "I cooked tonight." He loosened his tie and stepped closer. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," she said. "You've had a long week." Their eyes met for a beat too long. There was something tender in his gaze, something that felt like an unspoken thank you. They ate together in a rare kind of peace. The conversation flowed easily, laughter filling the gaps that used to belong to silence. She found herself watching his face when he spoke, how his lips curved, slightly when amused, how his voice softened when he said her name. After dinner, he offered to help clean up. She laughed. "You? In a kitchen again?" "Don't underestimate my progress," he said, rolling up his sleeves. He reached for a plate at the same moment she did. Their hands brushed. Neither moved away this time. Her breath hitched. His eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment, everything around them disappeared. "Mirabelle," he said quietly, her name breaking the air like a confession. Her pulse raced. "Yes?" He took a slow breath, his tone low and certain. "You've changed this house?" She smiled faintly. "I didn't do much." "You did," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "You made it feel like home." The words hung there, heavy and sincere. She wanted to say something, anything, but her throat felt tight. He stepped closer, close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from him. "I don't know when it happened," he continued, "but lately, when I come home, The vibration of his phone cut through the silence. He froze. It buzzed again. A call. He glanced at the screen, and his jaw tightened. I have to take this. The moment shattered. He turned away, pressing the phone to his ear. Yes, I'm here. Send the file to my private line. No delays. His tone shifted. Back to the CEO, the businessman who never left room for vulnerability. Mirabelle stood still, watching as the wall she had seen crumble began to rebuild itself. When he hung up, she managed a quiet smile. Duty calls. He hesitated, guilt flickering across his face. We'll finish that conversation later. Sure, she said softly, even though both of them knew they wouldn't. As he walked out, she exhaled slowly. The warmth in her chest was replaced by a quiet ache. Love, she realized, wasn't loud or certain. It was fragile, easily interrupted, and the hardest part was pretending she hadn't already fallen. The next few days felt different, too quiet, too charged. Every room in the mansion seemed to hold the echo of what almost happened between them. Neither spoke about it, but both carried it like an invisible thread that pulled whenever they crossed paths. Grant stayed longer at work. Mirabelle noticed. His dinners grew later, his texts fewer. It wasn't avoidance in the cruel sense. It was fear disguised as discipline, the kind of fear that comes from caring too much when you never meant to care at all. She tried to focus on her daily routines, emails to her brother, updates from her mother's doctor, sorting through the bills she'd promised to handle. But every time her phone buzzed, she hoped it was him. Every night when the clock hit 10, she listened for his footsteps in the hallway. Sometimes she heard them. Most times she didn't. Grant wasn't faring better. In his office, he caught himself staring at his computer screen, unable to focus. Every number blurred into the memory of her laugh. Every negotiation reminded him of the one deal that wasn't on paper, the quiet bond growing between them. He'd never been afraid of loss before. Business had trained him to detach, to move on. But the thought of losing Mirabelle, of breaking something fragile he hadn't meant to build, made his chest tighten in ways he couldn't name. One evening, he came home early. The lights were dim, the air still. Mirabelle was in the living room, reading. She looked up, startled to see him. "You're home before midnight," she said softly. He smiled faintly. Trying something new. She gestured to the chair across from her. Then, sit. He did. For a while, neither spoke. The silence between them was full, not awkward. Finally, she said, "Grant, what are we doing?" He met her gaze. "What do you mean?" "This," she said quietly. "Whatever this is. We keep getting closer, then pulling away." He didn't answer right away. His hand rested on his knee, fingers tapping once before he stopped. "Because I don't know what I'm allowed to feel." Her voice dropped. "And if there were no rules?" His eyes softened. "Then I'd tell you I think about you more than I should." The words hung between them, quiet but powerful. She exhaled, steady but trembling. "And what if I said I feel the same?" He looked down, jaw tightening. "Then we'd both be in trouble." Her heart ached at his honesty. Maybe trouble isn't always bad. He stood after a long pause, his voice low. "Maybe not. But right now, I can't risk breaking something I don't know how to fix." When he walked away, she watched him go. Part of her wishing he'd stayed, part of her relieved he hadn't. Both knew the truth. They were no longer pretending. But admitting it out loud would change everything, and neither was brave enough to take that step yet. The Walkings Foundation's annual gala was one of the city's biggest events. Lavish, crowded, and designed to impress investors and reporters alike. Every chandelier gleamed, every glass reflected wealth, and every face wore a mask of charm. Mirabelle had attended many functions by Grant's side, but this one felt different. The tension between them had grown since that near confession, and though they stood together tonight, it felt as though they were miles apart. Her stylist had chosen a deep emerald gown that hugged her gracefully without screaming for attention. As she stepped out of the car, flashes went off from every direction. Cameras shouted her name now as often as his. Grant extended his hand. "Ready? As I'll ever be," she replied, slipping her fingers into his. Inside, the ballroom shimmered. Soft music played while servers glided between tables carrying champagne. Grant greeted partners, investors, and board members with effortless confidence. Mirabelle smiled politely, listening, nodding, existing in the background of his world, until she felt eyes on her. Tate Hollis, CEO of a rival company, stood across the room, watching her with unmistakable interest. He was known for his charm and for testing boundaries. When their gazes met, he smiled. Within minutes, he made his way over. "Mrs. Walkings," he said smoothly, extending his hand. "You look stunning tonight. I was hoping I'd see you here." Mirabelle hesitated but shook his hand politely. "Mr. Hollis, I've heard your name come up quite a bit in business circles. Hopefully in flattering ways," he said with a grin. "I'd hate to think Grant only mentions me as competition." Her lips curved slightly. "I doubt he wastes that much energy." Tate laughed, leaning in a little too close. "Then maybe you'll keep me in mind the next time you're planning charity work. I'm always happy to collaborate, with the right people." Before she could respond, Grant appeared beside her. His tone was polite, but his expression had hardened. "Hollis." Tate turned, unfazed. "Grant, always a pleasure." Grant's jaw flexed once. "Don't you have an audience waiting?" Tate's smile widened. "Of course. But some company is worth delaying for." Mirabelle felt the tension rise between them, thick and unspoken. Tate finally nodded, excused himself, and walked away, leaving behind a silence that didn't feel safe. Grant didn't speak. He just offered her a drink, his expression unreadable. But the storm had already started brewing behind his eyes. The night moved on, filled with polished laughter and champagne bubbles. The orchestra played a slow rhythm that rolled through the ballroom, but Mirabelle could sense Grant's distance beside her. His hand brushed hers once when photographers passed, but otherwise he stayed composed, too composed. When he left her briefly to speak with a board member, Tate Hollis returned. Confident, charming, and unapologetically bold, he always knew how to steal a spotlight. Tonight, he aimed it directly at her. "Mrs. Walkings," Tate greeted, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "I believe one of these belongs to you." Mirabelle hesitated. "You shouldn't assume." He grinned. "Then consider it a hopeful gesture." She took the glass politely. "You're persistent." "I've been called worse," he said easily, stepping a little closer. "Tell me, what's it like being married to the most unapproachable man in New York?" Her expression stayed neutral. "I wouldn't call him unapproachable." "Come on," Tate said with a smirk. "The man treats emotion like it's a hostile takeover. You, on the other hand, your life in human form, warm, graceful, a little unpredictable." She raised a brow. "You don't even know me." He leaned slightly forward. "Then let me—" It was harmless flirting, on the surface. But the way Tate's gaze lingered, the deliberate charm in his voice, made it clear this was more than idle talk. Around them, a few guests turned to watch, amused by the tension. That was when Grant returned. His presence was silent, but immediate. The warmth that had softened him in recent weeks was gone, replaced by the familiar cold precision that made boardrooms go silent. "Tate," he said coolly, "I see you've found someone else's evening to ruin." Tate smiled. "Not ruin, brighten, though I can't blame you for being territorial." Grant's eyes flicked to Mirabelle, then back to him. "I don't need to be territorial to recognize poor manners." Tate raised his glass slightly. "Then I'll take that as a compliment." Before Mirabelle could intervene, Grant took her hand. "My wife's had enough conversation for tonight." His tone was calm, but his grip was firm, too firm. He led her away before she could respond, his posture rigid, his jaw set. As they walked toward the exit, the crowd's eyes followed them. The whispers began before they even reached the door. For the rest of the night, neither of them said a word. But the silence in the car on the way home wasn't empty. It was simmering. The car ride home was thick with silence. The city lights flashed through the tinted windows, but neither of them spoke. Grant's hands stayed tight on the steering wheel, his expression locked in stone. Mirabelle watched him from the passenger seat, her jaw clenched, her own pulse beating hard in her throat. When they finally pulled up to the mansion, he parked abruptly and stepped out first. She followed him inside, closing the door behind her with care. "Grant," she began softly, "you're angry." He turned, his voice low but sharp. "Angry? That's one way to describe watching my wife flirt with a man who would do anything to undermine me." Her eyes widened. "Flirt? That's what you saw." "What I saw," he said, pacing across the room, "was you smiling, laughing, letting him stand close enough to make a point." "A point?" she repeated, her tone rising. "You think I was performing? I think you knew exactly what you were doing," he snapped. "You've been in this house long enough to understand appearances matter." She stared at him, stunned. "So now I'm part of your brand management." He exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. "That's not what I said. It's what you meant," she said quietly. "You don't trust anyone, do you?" He met her eyes, voice tight. "Trust isn't something I give easily." "And affection?" she asked. "That part of your budget too?" That hit him. His shoulders stiffened, but he didn't answer. Mirabelle stepped closer, her voice trembling with controlled anger. "Do you know what hurts, Grant? It's not your jealousy. It's that you think I'd need another man's attention to feel seen." He turned away, his silence a wall. Her chest ached. "You think I embarrassed you? But the only person who should be embarrassed is the man who still treats his wife like a contract he regrets signing." That broke his restraint. His voice rose hard and cold. "You're my wife in name only. Don't forget that." The words cut through the air like glass. For a moment, neither breathed. The sound of rain starting outside filled the silence. Mirabelle blinked slowly, her composure breaking just enough for him to see the hurt in her eyes. "You're right," she said quietly. "I almost forgot." She turned and walked upstairs, her steps steady but heavy. Grant didn't follow. When the bedroom door closed, he stood alone in the living room, the echo of his own voice replaying like a punishment he couldn't silence. And for the first time in years, the man who controlled everything realized he'd just lost something he couldn't replace. Mirabelle stood halfway up the stairs when Grant's words hit her again, sharp, echoing, final. "You're my wife in name only. Don't forget that." She turned slowly, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry across the room. "You know, it's impressive," she said quietly. "You can build empires, negotiate billion-dollar deals, yet you can't say one kind word when someone stands beside you." Grant looked up at her from the base of the stairs, his posture rigid, his eyes conflicted. "Don't twist my words, Mirabelle." She laughed bitterly. "I don't have to. They speak for themselves." He took a few steps closer. "You think I wanted to feel that way tonight? To watch another man touch what's mine?" Her expression hardened. "I'm not yours, Grant. You bought a name, not a person." He froze at that. The words cut deep, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. "I stood there while you humiliated me," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "In front of people who already think I don't belong in your world. I smiled. I said nothing, because I didn't want to make a scene. And then you turn around and punish me for doing nothing wrong." He ran a hand through his hair, his breathing uneven. "I wasn't punishing you. I was—" "What?" she demanded. "Protecting me." "From what? Conversation? Compliments? You keep calling this a marriage. but every time I try to act like a wife, you remind me I'm a contract." Her words left him speechless. She took a step down, her voice softer but cutting. "You think jealousy proves you care, but all it proves is fear. You're scared to admit that maybe what's happening between us, feels real, because if you do, it won't fit in your world of control." He looked up at her, eyes clouded with guilt. "You don't understand." "No, Grant," she said firmly. Don't." For a long moment, they stood in silence, two people trapped in the wreckage of pride. Then Mirabelle turned and walked upstairs without looking back. Grant remained where he was, the sound of her footsteps fading above him. The words he'd thrown in anger now felt like chains around his chest. For the first time, the house he had built to feel invincible now felt empty, because for the first time she wasn't trying to fill the silence. Mirabelle sat on the edge of her bed, still in her gown from the gala. The zipper felt tight against her ribs, but it wasn't the dress suffocating her. It was the words. Every second of that argument replayed in her head, each sentence carving its own wound. She had spent months learning to live inside his walls, convincing herself that his small gestures meant something, that he was slowly changing. But now the truth felt clear and cruel. She had fallen for a man still chained to his fear. Her reflection in the mirror looked foreign, poised, elegant, yet broken. She reached up and unclipped her earrings, setting them on the nightstand one by one. The sound was soft. "Final, wife in name only," she whispered, her throat tightening. "That's what I am to him." Tears threatened but didn't fall. She refused to give pain that power. Instead, she stood, opened her wardrobe, and began packing a small bag. A few clothes, her laptop, the simple necklace her mother had given her before the wedding. She didn't know where she'd go, but she knew she couldn't stay. Not tonight. As she zipped the bag shut, her phone buzzed. A message from her brother. Mom's test results came back clear. The surgery worked. Mirabelle sat still for a moment, letting the relief wash over her. Then, slowly, a sad smile touched her lips. Her mother had survived. Her brother was doing well. Maybe it was time she saved herself too. Downstairs, Grant paced his study, a drink untouched on the table. He wanted to go to her, to apologize, but his pride anchored him in place. Every word he'd said felt like a mirror turned against him. Wife in name only. He hated how much it sounded like truth. When he finally walked upstairs, her room was dark. The bed was neatly made. The wardrobe door stood open, half empty. Her ring sat on the dresser, gleaming under the faint moonlight. He picked it up, his chest tightening as he closed his hand around it. The silence pressed in around him again. This time he'd earned it. Mirabelle, meanwhile, stood outside the mansion gates, pulling her coat tighter against the night air. For the first time in months, she breathed freely. This wasn't defeat. It was reclamation, and even if it broke her heart, she was finally choosing herself. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the wide windows, but it brought no warmth. The mansion, once filled with quiet rhythm and soft laughter, had returned to its old state, silent, polished, and hollow. Grant woke early, as he always did, but the house felt heavier. He stood by the kitchen counter, staring at the untouched cup of coffee Mrs. Keller had prepared. The smell reminded him of her, the way she used to hum softly while waiting for it to brew, the way she'd smile faintly at him across the table. Now, her chair was empty. When he entered her room, hoping to find her still asleep, he found only the note instead, folded neatly, resting beside her ring. No anger in her words, only truth. "You once told me feelings were a liability. Maybe you were right, but I refuse to live as one." He read the line 3 times, each one heavier than the last. For the rest of the day, he buried himself in work, taking meetings he couldn't remember, signing documents he didn't read. The calls blurred together. Every voice on the other end sounded distant. When someone asked if he was all right, he said what he always said, "I'm fine." But he wasn't. He came home late that evening to the same quiet she had left behind. The candles she used to light were gone. The music she sometimes played while cooking was gone too. Every trace of her warmth, her laughter, her presence, had been erased by her absence. He walked through the halls, his footsteps echoing against marble floors that had never felt so cold. For years he believed silence was control. Now it was punishment. Upstairs, Mirabelle sat in a modest apartment downtown, her small suitcase by the door. It wasn't luxury, but it was peace. She made tea and watched the city lights through the window. Her chest still ached, but beneath the pain was a steady calm. For the first time, she wasn't waiting for him to call. She wasn't hoping for change. She was choosing to stand on her own. And somewhere across the city, Grant finally realized what his money had never bought. Someone who loved him without condition. But by the time he understood it, she was gone. Grant left 3 days after their argument. There were no explanations, no discussions, no effort to make peace. Just a note on his desk, short, factual, void of emotion, emergency meetings in Europe, indefinite stay, handle public appearances as needed. When Mrs. Keller handed the note to Mirabelle, her fingers trembled slightly. He didn't even say goodbye? Mirabelle folded the paper quietly. He said enough the last time we spoke. By noon, his jet had taken off. The mansion grew still again, the silence thick and familiar. But now it carried a different kind of emptiness. This time, it wasn't distance. It was abandonment. Mirabelle tried to tell herself it didn't matter. He'd left before, for business, for power, for everything that had always come before her. But this time, the ache lingered longer than she expected. At dinner, she sat alone at the long table, her plate untouched. The clink of her fork against porcelain felt louder in the emptiness. She forced herself to eat a few bites, not out of hunger, but habit. The next morning, she stood at the balcony overlooking the city, watching the skyline fade into the distance. She wondered if he thought of her while crossing the Atlantic, or if he found relief in her absence. The headlines came days later. Grant Walkings expands into Europe. New venture marks historic deal. His name filled financial pages, his photos plastered across glossy covers. He looked composed, confident, untouchable. Mirabelle studied one of the photos, the sharp suit, the perfect posture, the faint smile that had once felt real. Her chest tightened. "You're doing fine," she whispered to the paper, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to him or herself. Each night, she found herself walking through the halls, tracing the outlines of their shared life. A cup he left on the counter, his book on the nightstand, the faint trace of his cologne in the hallway. Each small reminder hurt more than she expected, and still she refused to cry. Tears would mean defeat, and she had survived worse than heartbreak. Grant's absence didn't break her, it clarified her. The man she loved wasn't gone. He had never fully been there to begin with. Days passed slowly after Grant's departure, each one blending into the next. The mansion's silence, once tolerable, now felt alive, echoing, taunting. Every sound seemed amplified, the tick of the hallway clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the stairs. She had thought she'd gotten used to solitude, but this was different. This was abandonment wrapped in luxury. Mirabelle filled her days with purpose. She called her mother every morning, checking on her recovery. The surgery had been successful, and her mother's voice carried a new strength that lifted her spirit. "I'm walking more each day," her mother said cheerfully one afternoon. "You sound tired though, sweetheart. Are you okay?" Mirabelle smiled faintly. "I'm fine, Mama. Just working on some plans." "Plans? Nothing big," she said softly. "Just moving forward." After the call, she sat at her desk, staring at the blank notepad in front of her. Moving forward, the words felt both freeing and terrifying. She started spending her afternoons sorting through her belongings. Clothes she didn't wear, shoes she never bought for herself, but for the image Grant wanted. She donated most of them, keeping only what felt like her. With each box that left the house, she felt lighter. She also began looking for apartments quietly, using a separate email, careful not to leave traces. It wasn't about running, it was about reclaiming control. The 1-year mark of their marriage was approaching, and she didn't want to wait for that clock to define her freedom. At night, she walked through the garden, the same one where Grant once stood making calls. The winter chill brushed against her skin, but she stayed there, thinking about everything they'd built and destroyed. Somewhere between pretending and feeling, she had lost herself. Inside, Mrs. Keller noticed the change. "You've been quieter than usual," she said gently one morning. Mirabelle smiled weakly, just preparing for change. The woman studied her for a moment, as if she understood more than Mirabelle said. "Sometimes the hardest part of love," she replied, "is knowing when to walk away." Mirabelle nodded slowly. "I think I've reached that point." By the time she went to bed that night, the decision was clearer. She couldn't keep living in a house built on silence, waiting for a man who didn't know how to stay. This time, she wouldn't wait for his permission to leave. The night she decided to write the letter, the city outside was quiet. It wasn't sadness that guided her hand, it was release. She had spent months holding in everything she couldn't say, every word that would have shattered the fragile peace between them. Now she was ready to let them out. She sat at her desk by the window, her pen resting on thick stationery paper. The first few minutes passed in stillness. Then, slowly, her thoughts began to take form. "Grant, when I walked into that courthouse, I thought I was signing away my freedom. I didn't realize I was signing away my voice, too." Her handwriting was calm, but her chest tightened with every stroke. She paused, took a breath, and continued. "You said once that feelings complicate business. Maybe you're right, but marriage, even a fake one, isn't a contract. It's a mirror. I saw myself disappearing in it. I stopped recognizing the woman who once believed she could stand alone." She looked at those words for a long time. A tear blurred the ink slightly, but she didn't wipe it away. "You taught me discipline, focus, and patience. But you also taught me how loneliness grows when love is kept at a distance. I won't blame you for that. Maybe you did the best you could with what you knew. But I can't keep trying to earn warmth from someone afraid to feel it." Her hand slowed near the end. She wanted to finish it with grace, not bitterness. "I hope you find peace one day, the kind that doesn't depend on control or profit. I'll remember the man who smiled in the candlelight, not the one who walked away." She signed it simply, Mirabelle. When she finished, she folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope. She placed it on his desk in the study, where he used to spend nights working long after she'd gone to bed. The room smelled faintly of him, a mix of cedarwood and paper. For a moment, she felt her resolve weaken. The memories came rushing back, the way his voice softened when he spoke about his parents, the look in his eyes when he nearly kissed her that night. But she straightened her back, leaving the letter where it belonged. Among the things he valued most, his business papers. She whispered softly, "You won't read this to understand me. You'll read it to realize what you lost." Then she turned off the lamp and walked out. It wasn't a goodbye born from anger. It was one born from courage, the kind that comes when love turns into self-respect. By dawn, she knew what her next step would be. By morning, her resolve was no longer fragile. It was solid, calm, final. Mirabelle stood before the large window in her room, watching sunlight spill over Manhattan's skyline. The same city that once symbolized opportunity now felt like a chapter she was ready to close. The letter sat on Grant's desk downstairs, sealed and waiting. He might not read it right away, or ever. But that didn't matter. The act of writing it had done what months of silence couldn't. It set her free. She moved through the mansion with quiet purpose, gathering only what belonged to her. The dresses, the jewelry, the tailored coats, most had been chosen for her, not by her. They could stay. She packed one suitcase, filled not with luxury, but with identity, her mother's rosary, her brother's graduation photo, her laptop, and a few clothes she'd bought before her marriage. Mrs. Keller found her in the hall, suitcase by her side. The older woman's eyes softened. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Mirabelle nodded. "It's time." The housekeeper hesitated. "Does he know?" "No. And I don't plan to tell him." There was a pause, filled with unspoken understanding. Then Mrs. Keller took her hand gently. "You've been good for this place. It'll feel emptier without you." Mirabelle smiled faintly. "It already does." Outside, the car service she'd arranged waited at the gate. The morning air carried a crisp edge, but it felt like a new beginning. Each step toward that car felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Before she got in, she looked back at the mansion one last time. Its towering windows reflected the sun, cold and gleaming, much like the man who lived inside it. For a moment, she felt her heart twist. She remembered the small changes, the laughter in the kitchen, the quiet dinners, the rare softness in his voice. There had been something between them once, fragile and real, but it had never been enough to heal what he refused to face. She whispered under her breath, "You'll never change until you lose what loves you." Then she turned away. The drive to the airport was silent, but it wasn't heavy. She wasn't running anymore. She was walking toward peace. Her flight to Atlanta was booked for that evening. There, her mother was recovering well, her brother was thriving in school, and life still held meaning beyond contracts and cold walls. As the city disappeared behind her, Mirabelle closed her eyes. Her marriage had begun as a transaction, evolved into confusion, and ended in clarity. She hadn't found love, but she had rediscovered herself. And maybe that was the truest kind of victory. Her story wasn't ending. It was simply turning the page. The mansion was silent when Grant's car pulled into the driveway. He hadn't called ahead. He didn't need to. The jet lag, the endless board meetings, the noise of Europe's corporate world, none of it had quieted the thought that had been haunting him since he left. What if she doesn't wait? He walked through the grand doors, suitcase in hand, expecting to hear footsteps or the faint hum of music. Instead, the air felt still, too still. A faint echo of movement upstairs caught his attention. He followed it. The door to her room was open. Inside, Mirabelle stood beside her suitcase, folding the last of her clothes with a kind of calm that broke him. The sight of her doing something so final, so certain, hit him harder than any business loss ever could. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, startled for a moment. "You're back," she said, voice even but guarded. He exhaled, his throat tight. "What's going on?" "I think it's clear," she replied quietly. "I'm leaving." He stepped inside, eyes scanning the half-empty wardrobe, the folded clothes, the absence of her books on the nightstand. "Leaving where?" "Home," she said simply. "Atlanta. My mother's doing better. My brother's finishing his program. They need me more than this place ever did." Grant set down his briefcase. "You weren't supposed to go." Her gaze lifted to his. "I wasn't supposed to stay either." He moved closer, confusion and panic fighting to stay hidden. "If this is about the argument—" "It's about everything," she cut in. "About how you leave whenever things get too close. About how you think silence fixes what you break." He didn't answer. His jaw tightened, his silence proving her point. "You can keep the house, the company, the control," she continued. "I just want my peace." Grant's composure cracked for the first time in years. "Mirabelle, don't do this." She shook her head slowly. "I already have." The suitcase clicked shut, the sound small but final. He took another step forward, but the look in her eyes made him stop. For the first time, he saw it, the strength she had built in his absence. She wasn't leaving from pain. She was leaving from clarity. That realization cut deeper than anything she could have said. And for the first time, Grant Walkings didn't know how to stop something from slipping away. Grant's voice cracked through the silence first. "You can't walk out like this, Mirabelle. You can't just leave everything behind." She zipped the last compartment of her suitcase. "I already did the hard part, Grant. Leaving is just the final step." He moved closer, his usual calm replaced by urgency. "You're overreacting. You're hurt because I left, but we can fix this." Her laugh was short, bitter. "Fix? You think everything can be fixed like a quarterly report?" She looked at him then, eyes sharp and tired all at once. "You can't schedule emotions, Grant. You can't delegate care." He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face softened for the first time. He wasn't the commanding CEO now. He was just a man trying to make sense of what he'd broken. Mirabelle stepped past him to grab her coat from the rack. "You built walls so high, even you got lost behind them." "Stop talking like it's over," he said, stepping into her path. "We had something, Mirabelle." She looked at him, her eyes glassy but steady. "Yes, something you never wanted to name." He reached out, hand trembling slightly. "Please, don't." Her voice cut through the air, firm and unshakable. "Don't touch me unless you mean it." He froze. Her words hung between them, heavy, final. For once, his silence didn't command authority. It exposed his fear. His hand dropped slowly to his side. "You always wanted control," she said quietly. "Even now, you want to control how I leave." He stepped back, his chest rising unevenly. "I don't want control," he whispered. "I want you." She swallowed hard, but her tone stayed calm. "Then you should have fought for me when I was still here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air felt thin. Grant's lips parted, but no apology came. No confession either. He wasn't ready. Not in the way she needed him to be. Mirabelle picked up her suitcase. "You once told me love wasn't practical," she said. "Maybe that's why you'll never understand it." She moved toward the door. He followed her halfway down the hall, but he couldn't cross the space between them. She turned to him one last time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Goodbye, Grant." The sound of the door closing echoed through the mansion, soft but final enough to crush him. And for the first time in his life, Grant Walkings didn't have a plan. Mirabelle didn't rush out. She walked slowly, every step deliberate, every breath steady. The marble floor beneath her heels echoed softly, like a countdown to freedom. Her heart beat fast, but her hands were calm. For the first time since marrying Grant, she wasn't afraid of what came next. Mrs. Keller stood near the foyer, her eyes glistening. "You're really leaving, dear?" Mirabelle nodded gently. "It's time, Mrs. Keller." The woman hesitated, then pulled her into a brief hug. "He'll regret this," she whispered. Mirabelle smiled faintly. "Some lessons are meant to hurt." She turned toward the door just as Grant appeared at the top of the stairs. He wasn't the composed man the world knew. His tie was loose, his expression strained. "Mirabelle," he said, his voice softer now. "Don't go." She looked up at him, holding his gaze for a long moment. "You had every chance to ask me to stay when it mattered." He came down the stairs slowly, each step heavy with the weight of realization. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. "From the world, from the noise." Her tone stayed calm, but her eyes told the truth. "No, Grant, you were protecting yourself from feeling anything real." When he reached the last step, they stood only a few feet apart. The air between them pulsed with everything left unsaid. He reached for her suitcase handle, but she pulled it back. "You don't get to hold on now. Mirabelle, please." His voice broke, quiet and desperate. "Tell me how to make this right." She exhaled slowly. her strength unwavering. You can't buy peace, Grant, and you can't fix what you never tried to understand. The chauffeur appeared at the doorway. "Mum, your car is ready." She nodded without looking away from Grant. "Thank you." Grant stepped closer, but she held her ground. "Let me at least drive you," he pleaded. "No," she said softly. "You need to stay here and feel what it's like to be alone. Not because someone left, but because you pushed them away." Her words landed with quiet force. She reached for the doorknob, her pulse steady. "Goodbye, Grant. I hope one day you find what you were too afraid to hold." The door opened. A rush of cool air swept through the hall. Grant's eyes followed her until the car pulled away, the taillights fading down the long driveway. The echo of the closing door lingered long after she was gone, wrapping the house in a silence heavier than any storm. Grant didn't move. He stood in the same place she'd left him, his hands trembling, realizing, too late, that he'd lost more than a wife. He'd lost his peace. That night, Grant sat in his study, staring at the letter she had left on his desk. The envelope was unmarked, simple, yet it felt heavier than any document he had ever signed. His hand hovered over it for several minutes before he opened it. Her handwriting was neat, calm, just like her. As he read, the words sliced through the silence. Each sentence reminded him of moments he had dismissed, words he hadn't said, and chances he had buried under his pride. When he finished, he didn't fold the letter. He just sat there, eyes fixed on it, chest tightening with a feeling he could no longer name. For years, he had built his life on control. Every boardroom, every acquisition, every headline had been proof of his order. But now, none of it could fill the quiet that stretched across the mansion. The house that once echoed with restrained footsteps now felt hollow. He tried to work the next morning, opening his laptop and reviewing reports, but the numbers blurred. His thoughts drifted to the kitchen, where she used to hum softly while pouring her morning coffee. He went there almost by instinct. Her cup was gone. The air felt still. Even the sunlight seemed colder. He found himself wandering through the rooms she used to occupy. The garden, where she trimmed roses, the library, where she once read late into the night, the guest room she'd chosen as her workspace. Everything looked untouched, yet it screamed of her absence. He sat in her chair for a long time, his elbows on his knees, fingers pressed against his temples. He had all the wealth the world could offer, private jets, global contracts, limitless power, but none of it could buy back the warmth of her presence. He tried calling her number once. It went straight to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. What could he say? "I miss you" felt too small. "I'm sorry" felt too late. That evening, Mrs. Keller brought in his dinner, quietly setting the tray down. "You haven't eaten much lately," she said gently. Grant looked up at her, his eyes distant. Does it get quieter, or do we just stop hearing it? The woman hesitated, then replied softly, "You start hearing what's always been there, the silence you created." She left the room, and Grant sat alone, her words echoing. He looked around his empire of glass and steel and realized it was all built to keep people out. But now it had kept the only one who mattered away. For the first time, Grant Walkings understood the cost of his choices. Love couldn't be bought. Peace couldn't be negotiated. And no amount of money could fill the space Mirabelle Ellis had left behind. Grant stood in the empty hallway long after the sound of her car faded. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just listened to the echo of her absence. Every corner of the mansion reminded him of her, but in ways that hurt. The smell of her perfume lingered faintly in the air. The faint indent on the sofa where she used to sit. The silence where her laughter used to live. He had spent a lifetime mastering power. He knew how to buy companies, influence markets, silence critics, but he had never learned how to hold on to love. Mirabelle had asked for something simple, presence, not perfection, and yet he had given her distance instead of care, control instead of peace. He poured himself a drink that night and stared at his reflection in the window. For the first time, he didn't see the confident CEO who could fix everything with logic. He saw a man afraid of being known, of being loved for the parts he couldn't control. He thought about chasing her, booking a flight to Atlanta, showing up at her door, but something stopped him. This wasn't about winning her back. It was about understanding why she had to go. Sometimes love doesn't die because people stop caring. It dies because one person stops trying to understand. He sank into the couch, eyes heavy, heart heavier. He thought of her words. "Don't touch me unless you mean it." That wasn't anger. That was heartbreak wrapped in dignity. It was the kind of pain that forces both people to grow. And for the first time, Grant understood that maybe walking away was her way of saving. What was left of them, before resentment, erased the tenderness they once shared. To everyone watching this story, ask yourself, have you ever loved someone so much that staying started to hurt more than leaving? Sometimes walking away isn't about giving up. It's about giving love a chance to heal in silence. Do you believe leaving can save love? Or does love only survive when we choose to stay and fight for it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart. The drive from the airport to Atlanta's east side was longer than Grant expected. The city moved slower than Manhattan, its rhythm more human, its air less polished. As his car turned down a quiet suburban street lined with magnolia trees, he caught himself, staring out the window, wondering if this was where peace had been hiding all along. He hadn't told anyone about his trip. His assistant thought he was taking time off, but the truth was simpler. He needed to see her. Not as a CEO seeking to reclaim control, but as a man trying to face the emptiness he'd created. Her mother's house was small, but full of warmth. The paint was slightly faded, the porch creaked when he stepped on it, and a wind chime tinkled softly by the doorway. Through the living room window, he saw Mirabelle. She was sitting by her mother's bedside, helping her adjust a blanket, her voice calm and soft. Grant paused, watching her for a long time. She wasn't wearing designer clothes or makeup, yet she looked more radiant than he'd ever seen her. Her peace wasn't built on money or power, it came from purpose. Her mother noticed him first. "Mirabelle," she said, voice gentle but curious. "Someone's at the door." When Mirabelle turned and saw him standing there, the air between them shifted. Surprise crossed her face, followed by silence. He removed his cap, unsure of what to say. "Hi." Her lips parted slightly, the word trembling on her tongue. "Grant, what are you doing here?" "I wasn't sure until I got here," he admitted. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she turned to her mother. "I'll be right back, Mama." They stepped outside to the porch. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of rain. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The distance between them felt fragile but real. Grant finally said, "You look well." "I am," she replied, her tone careful. "Life feels simple again." He nodded slowly. "I'm glad." His eyes lingered on hers, but the weight of everything unspoken hung between them. This wasn't the confident man she had once married. This was someone stripped down to truth, standing in the aftermath of his own mistakes. The porch creaked softly under their feet as the evening light settled between them. Mirabelle crossed her arms, unsure whether to let him speak or ask him to leave. Grant stood still, his usual authority replaced by hesitation. The distance wasn't physical. It was the kind that comes from wounds neither person knows how to dress. She broke the silence first. "You came all the way here for what, Grant? Business? Closure?" His voice was quiet, almost unsure. "For honesty. Something I should have offered you a long time ago." Mirabelle's eyes narrowed slightly. "Honesty now, when there's nothing left to save?" "I don't expect you to believe me," he said, taking a step forward. But I couldn't keep pretending work mattered more than peace. I've been back in that house, Mirabelle. Every room feels hollow without you. Her jaw tightened, her emotions caught between anger and compassion. You built that world, Grant. I just tried to survive in it. I know. His voice cracked faintly. I didn't come here to defend myself. A quiet fell between them again. From inside, her mother's faint laughter echoed, followed by the hum of a television. The simplicity of it, the kind of life Mirabelle had fought to protect, made something in him ache. He looked at her with a sincerity she hadn't seen before. You once told me that love isn't about fixing things. I thought that was weakness. I was wrong. Mirabelle exhaled softly, her hands trembling slightly. Do you know what it took for me to leave, Grant? I walked away not because I stopped caring, but because I couldn't keep begging for something you refused to feel. I know, he said, voice steady but heavy. And that's why I'm here. Not to ask for another chance, not yet, but to face what I turned away from. Her heart twisted. He looked different, not just tired, but changed. The sharp lines in his face seemed softer now, his tone stripped of pride. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Mirabelle sighed and sat on the edge of the porch steps. After a pause, she nodded toward the space beside her. If you're going to talk, you might as well sit. Grant hesitated, then joined her. They sat side by side, the kind of silence that didn't hurt anymore. It simply was. Sometimes healing doesn't start with forgiveness. It starts with showing up. The sky above them turned faintly gold as the sun began to sink. The air smelled of wet grass and jasmine, carrying the softness of an Atlanta evening. Mirabelle's hands rested in her lap, her fingers lightly tracing the hem of her blouse, waiting. Grant leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice low but sure. When I left for Europe, I told myself I was protecting the company, that I couldn't afford distractions. He paused, shaking his head slightly. But the truth is, I was protecting my ego. I couldn't handle the idea that someone saw through me, and still stayed. Mirabelle glanced at him, cautious but listening. He continued, his eyes fixed on the horizon. I thought pride made me strong. I thought control kept me safe. But when I came home to an empty house, I realized all I'd built was a fortress, one that kept out everything human. His voice grew quieter. You asked me once what it would take for me to believe in love. I never answered. Maybe because I didn't know how to, but now I do. Mirabelle looked at him carefully, not out of pity, but curiosity. And what's your answer now? He turned toward her, eyes steady. Losing you? She froze, her heart pounding against her ribs. Grant went on, his words deliberate, fragile. I came here to return something, my pride. It cost me everything that mattered. You, peace, sleep, everything. For the first time, she saw something in his face that wasn't polished confidence. It was regret, raw and unfiltered. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. I kept these, he said quietly, holding it out. The divorce papers. You sent them unsigned. Mirabelle's breath caught. Why? Because signing them felt like closing the only door that ever led me somewhere real. She didn't take them right away. Her eyes flicked from the papers to his expression. Steady, open, sincere. I can't erase what I did, he said, voice low. But I can stop hiding behind my success. I came here because, for once, I don't want to win. I want to understand. The porch light flickered on as evening deepened. Mirabelle didn't speak for a while. She simply looked at him, the man she once thought incapable of humility, finally admitting he was human after all. And for the first time, his truth didn't sound like a strategy. It sounded like surrender. Grant's hand trembled slightly as he unfolded the papers. The crisp sound of the pages cutting through the quiet felt louder than any words between them. He placed them gently on the wooden porch table, the edges fluttering faintly in the breeze. I carried these with me everywhere. he said softly. Across boardrooms, hotels, even when I pretended not to think about you. They were supposed to be my closure. Mirabelle looked down at the papers, the official stamp, the blank signature line. It was surreal. How something so small could hold so much pain. I read them more times than I should have, he continued. Each time, I asked myself why I couldn't sign. The answer was always the same, because the woman I hurt deserved more than my prideful silence. Mirabelle swallowed hard, her throat tight. You could have mailed them back, she said quietly. I know. He nodded, eyes heavy. But I needed to give them back myself. You deserved that much. For a moment, neither moved. The faint chirp of crickets filled the air. Grant's expression softened as he slid the papers toward her. These belong to you now. You decide what happens next. If you want me out of your life for good, I'll accept that. But if there's even a part of you that believes people can change— He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. His silence carried more sincerity than 1,000 apologies. Mirabelle stared at the papers, her reflection caught in the glass table below. A woman torn between pain and hope. She brushed her fingertips along the signature line, remembering all. The times she'd stood alone, wishing for a word, a gesture, anything. You think you can just hand this over and fix everything? She asked softly, not accusingly, but with the weariness of someone who'd seen promises fade before. He shook his head slowly. No, this doesn't fix anything. It only proves that I'm done hiding from what I destroyed. She looked up at him, eyes glistening. You're too late for the marriage we had, Grant. I know, he whispered, but maybe not too late for the truth. For a while, she didn't respond. The papers stayed between them, untouched, a symbol of everything broken, yet unfinished. When she finally met his eyes again, the anger was gone. What replaced it wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but something gentler, understanding, and for the first time since she left, silence between them didn't hurt. It healed. The wind picked up softly, carrying the faint scent of rain and garden soil. Mirabelle sat back, staring at the papers again, her thoughts tangled. The night had wrapped them in a fragile calm, neither bitter nor sweet, just still. Grant's confession hung in the air between them, raw and real, and it left her unsure of what to do next. She exhaled slowly. You always knew how to talk, Grant. Words were your weapon. But this— She gestured at the papers. This isn't about words anymore. I know, he said quietly. That's why I'm not asking for forgiveness tonight. I just want you to see that I finally understand what I did. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the papers. You broke something that took me years to build— trust. Grant nodded. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to rebuild it, even if I never get to call you mine again. Her eyes softened for the first time. The edge in her voice faded, replaced by exhaustion and truth. You always think in terms of goals, don't you? Even your regret sounds like a mission. He smiled faintly, more pain than humor in it. Maybe that's the only way I know how to say, I'm sorry. For a moment, they both fell silent again. The porch light flickered gently, catching the faint shimmer of tears in her eyes. Grant's gaze dropped to her hands, steady, delicate, resting on her lap. He hesitated, then slowly reached across the space between them, stopping halfway. She looked down at his hand. It wasn't a demand, it wasn't a plea, it was an offering. After a long pause, she placed her hand over his. It was small, the gesture barely noticeable, but it felt like the beginning of something honest. His thumb brushed the back of her hand lightly, uncertain but thankful. You don't have to say anything, he murmured. This is enough. Her eyes glistened. I'm not ready to forgive you, Grant, but I don't hate you any more. He nodded, voice soft. That's more mercy than I deserve. They stayed that way for a while. No promises, no plans, no conditions. Just two people breathing in the same quiet, letting peace return in slow, trembling steps. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't come in words. It begins in silence, in the space where two hands meet and broken things start to feel whole again. The sound of crickets filled the quiet space around them. The porch light cast a soft glow on their faces, showing every trace of emotion neither dared to hide anymore. Mirabelle's hand was still resting on his, but her mind raced. She had dreamed of this moment, his apology, his humility, but now that it was here, she didn't know if her heart could trust it. She slowly pulled her hand back, her voice steady but fragile. "Grant, you can't expect things to go back to what they were. I can't just forget the silence, the distance, the way I felt invisible in that house." He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't want things to go back. I want something better, something real." She looked away, trying to steady her breath. "You say that now, but what happens when control starts to slip again? When I say something you don't like? When I stop fitting into the version of life you built?" "I'll listen," he said firmly, "even if it hurts." Mirabelle studied him closely. There was no arrogance in his tone, no trace of the businessman who once calculated every word. He looked human, worn, changed. The kind of man who had finally learned that love isn't a deal, it's a decision. Still, hesitation lingered in her chest. "I don't want to rebuild something that might break me again," she whispered. Grant leaned back slightly, his voice quiet, almost breaking. "You don't have to decide now. I came here knowing you might never take me back. I just needed you to know I'm done running. From you, from love, from the truth." Her throat tightened. He wasn't asking, he was accepting. That vulnerability, the kind she had begged to see for so long, sat heavy between them. After a long pause, she said softly, "You hurt me, Grant. But seeing you like this, I can't lie. It moves me." He gave a faint, weary smile. Then, maybe pain wasn't wasted after all. She sighed, looking up at the night sky. "I need time." He nodded. "Take all you need. I'll wait. No conditions this time." Their eyes met one last time, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a goodbye. It felt like an understanding, unfinished, uncertain, but alive. As Grant stood to leave, Mirabelle watched him walk down the path, under the soft glow of the porch light. He didn't look back this time. He didn't have to, because for the first time they were both walking toward healing. No contracts, no power, only truth. Grant didn't leave Atlanta after that night. He found a small apartment a few blocks away from Mirabelle's home, and every morning he showed up, not with flowers or promises, but with quiet consistency. He brought groceries, helped with repairs around the house, and drove her mother to follow up appointments without being asked. At first Mirabelle was wary. She expected him to vanish again, to retreat into his world of numbers and power once the guilt faded, but he didn't. When her mother's medication was delayed, he spent an entire afternoon calling pharmacies. When a pipe burst in the kitchen, he rolled up his sleeves and fixed it, ignoring her protests. Her mother, warm and sharp-eyed, noticed the shift before Mirabelle did. "That man is different," she said one evening as Mirabelle tucked her in. "People don't change that easily," Mirabelle replied quietly. "Maybe not. But regret can make a person humble, and humility makes room for love." Mirabelle thought about that long after her mother fell asleep. The Grant she saw now wasn't the man who had demanded control. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his tone was careful, honest in a way that didn't try to impress. One afternoon, she found him outside trimming the overgrown hedge near the porch. "You don't have to keep showing up," she said gently. He looked up, sweat on his brow, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not here out of obligation, Mirabelle. I'm here because peace feels closer when I'm around you." Her chest tightened. She didn't answer right away. Part of her wanted to believe him, but another part feared believing would mean losing herself again. Still, she let him stay. Not as a husband, not yet, but as a presence that no longer carried pain. By the time spring arrived, the house felt lighter. Her mother's health improved, laughter returned to the evenings, and the air between her and Grant softened. Change had come quietly, not through words, but through actions that finally matched them. Time passed gently, without pressure or pretense. The rhythm of their days found balance, steady, honest, and human. Grant no longer filled the air with plans or apologies. Instead, he showed up, quietly doing what needed to be done. When her mother grew strong enough to walk again, he was there beside her, holding her elbow with patient steadiness. For Mirabelle, healing didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, small moments that reminded her she could trust again. It was the way he fixed her mother's chair without being asked, the way he waited for her to speak instead of interrupting, the way his eyes softened whenever their gazes met. Sometimes they shared coffee on the porch, their conversations drifting between work, memories, and what peace meant to each of them. Grant spoke less about his company and more about what he was learning, how success meant little when built on loneliness. "I used to think love was a distraction," he said one morning. "But maybe it's what keeps us from losing our humanity." Mirabelle looked at him quietly, then nodded. "Maybe it's both, a risk and a refuge." That became their rhythm. Honest words, shared silences. Every act of kindness slowly rebuilt something deeper than affection, trust. Grant, too, was changing in ways that reached beyond her. He started donating anonymously to local clinics and youth programs, the same kind his grandfather had once dismissed as unprofitable. But when reporters tried to reach him, he declined every interview. "Some things," he told Mirabelle, "aren't meant to be public." It wasn't grand gestures that healed them. It was humility. The man who once measured worth in deals now found peace in small things. Cooking breakfast for her mother, helping a neighbor carry groceries, or watching the sunset in silence beside Mirabelle. She noticed the change most one afternoon when her mother smiled and said, "He doesn't look restless anymore." Mirabelle turned to Grant, who was kneeling by the garden, his hands covered in soil, his face calm. "No," she whispered, half to herself. "He finally looks home." Healing hadn't been fast. It hadn't been easy. But it had been real, and this time it belonged to both of them. The evening air was warm, heavy with the scent of magnolias from the yard. Mirabelle sat on the porch steps, watching the soft glow of the horizon, while her mother rested inside. She heard footsteps approaching and didn't need to look up. She knew it was him. Grant stopped a few feet away, holding something behind his back. His expression carried both calm and nervousness, a blend she had never seen before. "You've been quiet lately," he said softly. "I've been thinking," she replied, still looking at the sunset, "about life, about peace, about what comes next." He smiled faintly. "I've been thinking too, but I already know what comes next for me." She turned to him then, brows furrowed. "Grant." He took a deep breath, stepped closer, and revealed a small velvet box. It wasn't new. The edges were slightly worn, the color faded, simple, unpolished, and sincere. "This time," he said quietly, "there's no contract, no lawyers, no headlines, just me." Mirabelle's eyes softened, her pulse quickening. "Grant, you don't have to—" "I do," he interrupted, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't deserve another chance, but I'm asking for one. Not as the man who bought your name, but as the man who finally learned what love costs." He knelt, not with arrogance, but humility. "You taught me that love isn't measured in worth, it's measured in effort. So, I'm not offering money, promises, or perfect plans. I'm offering something I never did before. My heart, my time, my peace." Tears welled in her eyes. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. This wasn't the cold billionaire she once knew. This was a man stripped bare, kneeling on the same porch where he had once confessed his failures. "Grant," she whispered, her voice shaking, "I don't need a ring to know you've changed." He smiled gently. "I need it, not to prove anything, but to remind myself of the woman who made me better." Her silence stretched, heavy but full of emotion. Then finally, she reached out and touched his face. "You don't owe me grand gestures. You owe me honesty. And right now, I believe you." He rose slowly, taking her hands in his. "So, is that a yes?" She smiled through her tears. "It's a maybe, with hope attached." They both laughed softly, the sound fragile but true. The sunset faded into evening, and for the first time their hearts met without conditions. It wasn't a perfect proposal, it was a real one, and that made it everything. The wedding took place on a quiet afternoon in the backyard of Mirabelle's family home. No photographers, no designers, no headlines screaming about the billionaire who remarried his former wife. This time, it was only family, a few close friends, and the sound of wind moving through the trees. Mirabelle wore a simple ivory dress that her mother helped sew. It wasn't expensive, but it fit her perfectly. She pinned her hair with the same clips she used to wear when she was a financial analyst, back when her dreams were smaller, but her heart was lighter. Grant stood under the oak tree, dressed in a white shirt and grey trousers. No tie, no cufflinks, just ease. When Mirabelle walked toward him, his breath caught in his chest, not because she looked flawless, but because she looked at peace. The officiant was a neighbor, a retired pastor who had known Mirabelle's family for years. His words were short and simple. "You've both walked through pride and pain," he said. "Now walk together through peace." Grant's hand trembled as he slipped a small silver band onto her finger. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. Mirabelle smiled faintly. "You earned it the day you learned to listen." They didn't exchange elaborate vows. Instead, they promised 3 things: honesty, patience, and partnership. Each word carried more weight than any diamond ever could. Her mother wiped tears quietly from her chair, smiling when Grant bent down to thank her after the ceremony. "You've come far," she said softly. "Don't let the world make you forget what simple love feels like." Afterward, they shared food on mismatched plates, laughter spilling across the lawn. Grant helped clean up, rolling up his sleeves, laughing as Mirabelle teased him for breaking a glass. There was no tension, no show, only 2 people who had learned that love is strongest when it's ordinary. Later that night, when the guests had gone, Mirabelle and Grant stood alone under the same oak tree where they had exchanged vows. The moonlight washed over them, and Grant pulled her close. "No more contracts," he said quietly. She smiled against his chest. "Only commitment." And for the first time, their silence didn't represent distance. It represented peace. Their love wasn't grand or loud. It was steady, human, and enough. That night, as the newlyweds sat on the porch together, the air around them felt still, sacred even. The world outside kept moving, cars passing, distant laughter from the neighbors, but within that small circle of light, there was only them. Mirabelle leaned her head on Grant's shoulder, her voice quiet. "You know what's strange? After everything, the moment that means the most isn't the wedding. It's this." Grant looked down at her. "Sitting here?" She nodded. "Peace. Knowing I don't have to fight to be seen anymore." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "That's what I chased for years without knowing its name." She smiled faintly. "You thought peace lived in power, and you proved it lives in people," he replied softly. The words settled between them, honest and clear. There was no wealth, no fame, no noise, only the priceless quiet of 2 people who had finally learned to rest in each other's presence. Mirabelle glanced at their intertwined hands, her wedding band glinting faintly in the porch light. "You once offered me $50 million, she said teasingly. Now, I'd say you got the better deal." Grant chuckled. "You're not wrong." They laughed together, not because of joy alone, but because they finally understood what love was and what it wasn't. It wasn't about saving face. It wasn't about power or perfection. It was about growth, humility, and choosing the same person again, even after pain. The night deepened. Fireflies blinked across the yard, and a soft breeze carried the scent of flowers through the air. Mirabelle whispered, "Love isn't about wealth. It's about worth." Grant nodded. "And the right person teaches you the difference." To everyone watching this story, ask yourself, what do you believe is truly priceless in love? Is it trust, patience, forgiveness? Share your answer in the comments. Let's see how many of us agree that the real measure of love isn't found in gifts or promises, but in growth, peace, and the willingness to stay when it matters most. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what real love feels like. A year later, the city lights of Manhattan shimmered against the evening sky as guests filled the ballroom of the Walkings Foundation's annual charity gala. It was the first event Grant had hosted since his return, but this time things were different. There were no reporters waiting for headlines, no extravagant displays of wealth. The focus was simple: raising funds for community clinics and single-parent programs. At the center of it all stood Mirabelle, elegant in a soft blue gown that caught the light every time she moved. She smiled as she spoke with volunteers, her warmth genuine and effortless. Grant watched her from across the room, not with pride, but with quiet gratitude. The woman who once stood in the background now led the purpose of his company's future. When he finally joined her at the podium, the crowd fell silent. He adjusted the microphone and glanced toward her, his eyes filled with something deeper than admiration. "A year ago," he began, "I learned that wealth isn't measured by what you keep, but by what you give. Tonight, we're not here to celebrate money. We're here to celebrate second chances, because sometimes the richest moments come from the people who forgive us." Applause filled the hall, but Grant's focus never left Mirabelle. She stepped beside him, her hand brushing his briefly. "He forgot to mention," she said with a small smile, "that change isn't instant. It takes time, patience, and humility. But when love is real, it's worth rebuilding." The audience smiled, touched by their sincerity. Cameras flashed, but for once, neither of them seemed to care. Later that night, after the guests had gone, Grant and Mirabelle stood on the balcony overlooking the city, the same skyline that once separated them. Now, it felt like a witness to their redemption. Mirabelle whispered, "Do you ever think about how it started?" He smiled faintly. Every day, a deal, a signature, a mistake that turned into everything right. She leaned into him, her voice soft. "Love without contracts. It's the only kind that lasts." Grant wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "And this time," he said, "I'll never take it for granted." Beneath the city lights they stood together, two people who had once been strangers bound by obligation, now partners bound by grace. True love begins where pride ends. Money fades, success shifts, but peace, built through humility, endures. Sometimes the greatest wealth isn't what you earn, it's who you become when love teaches you to start over.